We already discussed Byron Donald's disastrous appearance on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. On that same show, you also had a more rational Republican, Chris Christie, appear, and he made some really interesting points about Trump, and the first one that I'll show you is the why, behind why Trump is now relying on these vile attacks that Byron Donalds tried to defend against Kamala Harris and questioning her biracial identity. And Chris Christie does make a really good point. Obviously, there's the obvious race baiting going on, but Chris Christie makes a parallel point to that I want to show you, and then we'll get to him making a really devastating point in the same interview about Trump and how he may have created his own nightmare.
Impulse. You can't imagine that anybody who understands anything about politics would say, hey, here's a great idea. Go to the National Association of Black Journalists and question whether Kamala Harris is really black or not. This is what happens, George, and this is how you can tell that this race is changing. Because what happens is when Donald Trump's ahead and he feels like he's comfortably ahead, he is willing to go with conventional, smart political advice. As soon as he thinks it's getting close, he goes back to the greatest hits. You saw this at the convention when he didn't think he was getting the reaction he wanted from the beginning of the speech. He went back to the greatest hits. You saw it at the NABJ, and you saw it last night in Atlanta.
Attacking the Republican governor.
Right. Now, here's Brian Kemp, who he has attacked mercilessly since 2020. Sponsored a primary candidate against him, who, by the way, Kemp got 70% of the vote against in the primary, beat Trump's endorsed candidate. And this is a guy who won big in 2022 when lots of other Republicans up and down the ticket, including in Georgia, were losing. And so to attack Kemp is a stupid thing, but this is who he is, George. This is personal. He's juvenile. And so he's going to continue to attack not only Brian Kemp, but the women of Georgia should have heard loud and clear last night. He attacked First Lady Marty Kemp just as viciously as he attacked the governor. And that's the greatest hits. That's what he'll go.
Yeah, so both with his attacks against Brian Kemp, but then also what we're focusing on here is the way that he's been going after Kamala Harris. He's incapable, it seems, of sticking to a policy, level-headed, can you imagine, Trump, criticism of Kamala Harris, which shows his and his movement's desperation if they're having to rely, as I've said now so many times, on these sorts of attacks. And to Chris Christie's point, while Trump is never on the rails, okay, he's always off the rails, he does go more off the rails when he starts to panic about a race. And that's what we're seeing here. We looked at the polling in a different segment, but Kamala Harris has been surging in the polls, especially compared to where Biden was right before he dropped off the ticket. And so now, as Trump gets more desperate, he's so disoriented as to how to make the case. He had worked and worked and worked and built up this whole foundation of lies that then he could attack Biden off of. But he hasn't had the time to develop such a web of lies around Kamala Harris. And so, given that, and given that her identity provides for Trump a bunch of what he understands his audience, part of it, to get really revved up and angry about, a lot of targets there. And that's exactly what he relies on now that he's freaking out and he's desperate. And before getting to a little bit more of Chris Christie, here's a reminder of some of the because we've covered that a bunch, Trump posting Kamala Harris's birth certificate, not that stuff, but the other childish attacks against Kamala Harris during the rally.
The choice of this election could not be more stark. On the one hand, you have a radical left freak. You have a candidate who is fake.
Radical left freak, and then he just tells lies like this doozy.
She wants the government to stop people from eating red meat. She wants to get rid of your cows. No more cows.
No more cows in the United States, apparently. And if Kamala Harris gets into power, even though Biden and her are in power now and there's no attack on cows, then you have this.
Harris has the most ultra-left-wing agenda of any presidential candidate ever in history. There's never been anybody like this. She is considered more left-wing than crazy Bernie Sanders. Look at her. She's worse than Bernie. And she happens to be really a low IQ individual. She really does. She has a very low IQ.
And yet he seems deathly afraid to appear on a debate stage with her if it's not in a comfy little environment like Fox News. So vile stuff there, but that's what he does when he's terrified. He can't stay on message. He can't be disciplined. He can't take the advice of political strategists. He can't make a policy case. It has to be petty, personal insult. And trying to tap into, relying on the worst of humanity, right? Tapping into those worst parts of people in a way that is really sad to see. Think about this. All the people who watch the show regularly, if you divide just the people who aren't subscribed, that group, if each and every one of you click the subscribe button today, we'd be instantly to 1 million subscribers. That'd be pretty cool. Click it if you haven't already. Thank you so much. Back to the video. Then Chris Christie said this as well.
This is really important. And I'll tell you this, if she picked Shapiro on Tuesday, Donald Trump created Josh Shapiro.
How so?
He endorsed Mastriano, the weakest Republican candidate in that field. What it allowed Josh Shapiro to do was, instead of playing to his base to try to win a narrow election, he saw an opportunity for a coalition building election, and that's what he did. So now he's seen as a coalition builder because he did it, but the only reason he could do it is because Trump made another ridiculously stupid endorsement by endorsing Mastriano, who was a flawed, weak, bad candidate. If Josh Shapiro winds up winning and Trump loses Pennsylvania, he can go back to his decision in 2022 as planting the seeds for that loss. It's
honestly a fantastic point, and this is more than just Pennsylvania, but that's a great example. Doug Mastriano got trounced in a purple state, trounced by Josh Shapiro in that gubernatorial race. And that was because of his hardcore MAGA, election denying, all that stuff, right? And Trump endorsed him. And that election did allow for Josh Shapiro to win with a bipartisan mandate that he's then been able to use as justification to govern in a way that has been bipartisan in a lot of ways. And that is a big part of his brand, that then if he is picked as Kamala Harris's vice presidential running mate, will be a part of why he was selected, why he is an effective surrogate, and could serve up Pennsylvania to Kamala Harris and to the Harris-Shapiro ticket, if that's what it ends up being. In part, as Chris Christie saying, which is brutal to Trump, because he had to pick the most radical, most rear-end kissing, boot-licking MAGA person he could find, who was a terrible candidate, so unpopular, and the election revealed that. And then across the country, Trump has done this where he's just weakened the Republican Party and allowed for Democrats to become much more popular in their states. We have Democratic governors across the country, people like Tim Walz, Josh Shapiro, Gretchen Whitmer, who are very popular and very effective in their governance. And while they should get credit for that, it's interesting to make it extra painful for Trump to perceive, to say a part of this is because of the disaster that is the Republican Party. So by contrast, Democrats are looking pretty dang awesome. And that disaster is because of MAGA being so present, and that you can, point at Trump for. Let me know what you thought of that in the comments. If you want to get extra content daily, you can do so by clicking the join button below. And if you want to get Luke Beasley Show merch with the logo you can see there on the computer, you can do so by going to lukebeasleymerch.com or clicking on the little pop-ups that are provided on YouTube.